From the Oregon State University's Extension Service, you are listening to In the Woods with the Forestry and Natural Resources Program. This podcast brings the forest to listeners by sharing the stories and voices of forest scientists, land managers, and enthusiastic members of the public. Each episode, we will bring you research and science-based information that aims to offer some insight into what we know and are still learning about forest science and management. Stick around to discover a new topic related to forests on each episode. Well, thank you for joining us on another episode of In the Woods. I'm Lauren Grand, Oregon State University Extension Forester and Associate Professor of Practice, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Today, we're going to be talking about a very special bird. The marbled murrelet is one of the Pacific Northwest's most mysterious seabirds. It nests in old-growth forests and spends much of its life at sea. In this episode, I get the pleasure of talking to Dr. Jim Rivers from Oregon State University to explore the groundbreaking research that he does in his lab on this elusive bird. We'll discuss the challenges of studying murrelets, the latest discoveries about their behavior and habitat needs, and what conservation efforts are needed to protect them. So hopefully you're fascinated by the intersection of forest ecology, wildlife conservation, and cutting-edge research because you're going to get a treat today. Welcome back to the podcast, Jim.
Great to be back.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here. I think last time I talked you into telling us the fascinating stories about pollinators and their roles in forest ecosystems. And I ended the episode with a promise that I'd make you come back to talk about marbled murrelets. So thank you so much for taking me up on that.
Of course.
So since then, you've been up to probably quite a bit. Do you want to give listeners a reminder about who you are and what you've been up to since then?
Sure. So I am a professor in the College of Forestry, and I'm a wildlife biologist. So a lot of the work that I do in the field for research is related to understanding how animals make their living out in our managed forest landscapes. And you mentioned pollinators. That's one of the two groups I work on focused on native bees, and then the other are birds, often birds that are nesting in forests, and trying to understand how they make a living relative to natural disturbances and to anthropogenic disturbances.
It's pretty cool, and it's pretty difficult for me to go out into the field or on site visits with landowners and not have a conversation about birds or pollinators when we're out in their forest. So it's an important field to study. Thanks for helping us get all that information. Okay, well, we're going to talk today about a very specific bird, the marbled murrelet, and maybe some people are familiar with it, but some might not be. So can you start with just an overview of who this bird is, a little bit about how it makes its living, and why it's so unusual?
Sure. So the marbled murrelet is a small seabird that is found along the Pacific coast. It varies in its range from California all the way up into the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. And it is highly unusual for its nesting behavior because it's a seabird and it's related to puffins. It's in the auk family. So if your listeners know puffins or murres, this is a close relative to those two species. And as a seabird, it gets all of its food from the ocean. So it's not all that different from its cousins. But how it's different evolutionarily is it's evolved this behavior where instead of nesting in large social colonies right along water's edge, this bird disperses inland and nests over very large distances. And they nest in older forests, typically old growth, but sometimes late successional forests as well. And the challenge with working with this bird in terms of its nesting is that there aren't colonies of murrelets that you find in the forest. They're dispersed and they're very secretive. They're very elusive as they go into their nest sites. They are trying to be evasive to predators and have as quiet a presence as possible during their nesting period. And so they can go up to, we have records of 40, 50 miles inland where nest sites have been located. It's typically not that far, but they do cover a lot of distances and they commute back and forth to those nests on a daily basis, either when they're incubating the eggs or when they're feeding the offspring.
So they are unique in that they sort of don't nest in colonies like their other cousin seabirds, and they nest in older forests. So you mentioned a little bit that might be because of trying to be elusive from predators. What other reasons might they nest in older forests, or are there any specific features of the older forests that they look for?
Yeah, what murrelets are looking for when they go inland for a nest site is a really large tree, and a large tree that has large horizontal limbs, because this species actually doesn't build a nest as much as it kind of creates a little hollow depression on a limb. And because of that, they often require a good thick mat of moss on horizontal limbs, and the limbs has to be horizontal because you can imagine that the egg won't stay on if the limb is at some sort of an angle. And so they're looking for limbs that are large enough to accommodate the chick and themselves when they come in to feed it. And so that typically means that they are in older forests, and as I mentioned earlier, old growth and late successional forests. So we're talking trees that may be 200, 300, 400 years old, may be several hundred feet tall. And because they don't build a nest, it's nearly impossible to see these birds land on the nest site when they come in. They usually do it under the course of darkness in the early morning hours or the late day hours, come in very quickly. This bird has a commuting speed of about 60 to 70 miles an hour, and it's been clocked on radar in a dive close to 100 miles an hour. So it's very fast. It's very small. It's about the size of a robin. And when it comes in, it doesn't call, doesn't make any sound. It's trying to be as furtive as possible. And in fact, Murrelets are one of the few species of auks that when they molt into their breeding feathers, the plumage that they have is very drab, and it's designed to be a camouflage pattern, where some of our other auks, like tufted puffins, which your readers or your listeners may be familiar with, have very, very colorful plumage. They have these bright yellow feathers on their head. Their bill gets bright orange and blue. Murrelets go in the exact opposite direction. They're trying to be furtive and not seen at all.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that. That seems like the opposite of everything you hear, that usually they want to be very showy and exciting to find a partner.
Yeah, and when they sit on the nest, they incubate the egg. One of the interesting things about Murrelets and what helps us find their nest, I think we may get to this, is that the male and female share the incubation duties. And so they do so for about 24 hours at a stretch. And then they swap back and forth. And during the day, the bird, when it's incubating the egg, whether it's the male or the female in the pair, and there is just one egg that's incubated, they barely move. And we have video footage of birds on the nest during the day, and all you can see for movement is the bird's eye blinking every minute or so. It just sits locked still. And again, it's designed to try and blend in and not look like anything in the forest environment that might be a potential food item for something like a Steller's jay or a common raven, which are two species that are often found depredating Murrelet nests.
Okay, I'm glad you touched on that. I was just going to ask that. It sounds like most of their, it sounds like, habits in terms of where they're mating and sitting on their, choosing as their nesting sites seem to be to avoid predator issues, because it sounds like they only have one egg at a time.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a single egg. It takes about a month to incubate completely. And that's with continuous incubation from the male and the female, as I said. And then that chick develops over a 4 to 6 week period, depending on how much food it's being fed. So if you think about that, that's 2 to 2.5 months long, where that nest is trying to avoid predation. So the parents are as stealthy as they can be, which makes our job a lot more challenging. And it perhaps is not surprising to learn that the Murrelet is the species with its last nest formally described by scientists. It wasn't until 1974 when we finally knew that Murrelets were nesting in trees and that there was a formal documentation by scientists. So it's eluded people for a long time. In fact, I think there's a $100 bounty on locating the nests and having evidence that would allow us to know that the birds truly nest in trees, because in the northern part of the range, they can nest on cliff faces that are inland from the coast. And they do that in British Columbia. They do that a little bit in Washington. They don't do that in Oregon or California. So they are nesting in kind of a similar site where they're up high, but whether or not they were a tree or ground nester was unclear for a long time.
Wow. Okay. That's pretty interesting too. So it's been a short amount of time that we've gotten a lot of details about how these birds live. Let's talk about that a little bit. So, as they've been difficult to study, I'm sure there's been more and more technology and new methods that had to be created to be able to find ways to study a bird that didn't want to be found. So what are some of the things that your lab has been doing and other scientists have been doing to try to figure out how to learn more about their nesting habits?
So there have been a number of different approaches used, and many of them have not been especially successful, including some that we've tried in our lab. The easiest ways to find Murrelet nests are to go to areas where Murrelets historically have been and look for them coming and going. And if you find the right flight path, you potentially can see a bird come into its nest. The problem with that is that you have to select a priori where that location is going to be. What that leads to is the possibility of finding a nest, but it may not be a random sample of the potential locations where a nest might be. And so what we did in our study was that we used VHF telemetry tags. These are tags that give off a pinging sound in a very high frequency range, and tell people it's not unlike if you ever watch a submarine movie like The Hunt for Red October and there's a sound of a submarine going off or being detected. Kind of like how VHF works. There's just a constant sound. We have receivers that we can dial into and we can actually hear it. And what that does is it gives us an idea of where the bird is. The challenge with that is that you have to be within a few kilometers of where the bird is located to pick up on that sound. They don't go for miles and miles. And for that reason, we started by saying, well, could we do better? Could we use some of this new technology where we have GPS tracking tags that communicate with satellites for the birds? We tried those, but they just didn't work very well for Murrelets, in part because they weren't designed for a diving bird. And Murrelets are, because they're seabirds, they're diving underwater after their prey. They need to have a tag that's has very limited drag on them. And so the tags that we tried, we didn't think that they were suitable for the birds. And we just tried a few and we went back to this VHF tag. So what that means is that we can use that tag effectively, and that's what previous researchers have used as well, but it requires a huge effort. And part of that effort is to spread out a large number of technicians every morning on the coast to look for the birds and try to figure out where they are in the nearshore environment. And then also having a plane basically on retainer waiting for the times when we have a bird that is detected in the ocean environment one morning, and then it's missing the next, and then it's back on the water the third day, and it's missing the fourth. And what that on-off pattern suggests is that the bird is going in for one of those incubation bouts, and it's staying in there. And so when that happens, that triggers us to go in and look for that particular bird. Now, each of these VHF tags have a separate individual signature, so we can know which bird has been missing from the group of birds that we have tagged. And that's where the plane gets up. It starts traversing the coast range. Fortunately, these birds are sitting on the nest during that incubation period. They're not moving, and they're pretty high in trees. So that means that the plane, if it gets up high enough, could pick up the tag. And then it's a matter of honing in on that location over and over. And so we have a technician that would get up in the plane and fly into concentric circles, and then that would give us a GPS point of where the bird was generally located. Then we had to hike in with a bigger crew to try and figure out which potential nest tree the bird was in. And then that's not always easy to do because the VHF tags that we used, the radio signals bounce off of large objects. And so when they hit trees or cliff faces, they bounce all over the place. And it can be really challenging to determine which tree the bird is in just from telemetry alone. So what that means is that our crew would have to go out in the pre-dawn hours, get up at 2 a.m, hike into these sites before dawn, and look up to the sky near these potential nest trees to try and detect the birds coming in and going by just visually detecting them. So that would work quite well, but sometimes it would take a day, sometimes it would take a week, depending on conditions and other constraints of the crew and of the site. So ultimately, that's what we went with. But one of the shortcuts that I thought we could use effectively was to use drones with thermal imaging cameras. And I'd heard a lot about using them to find nests and other projects. And I said, boy, this seems like a great opportunity for us to do the same. And so we partnered with Oceans Unmanned, which is an NGO with a couple of retired NOAA pilots. And they've gone from flying aircraft to flying drones. And we got out, we had FLIR donate a camera for us to use. We mounted it to the drone. And we did some test trials with Coturnix quail, these small Japanese quail that we put up in cages in the canopy of the trees. And the guys flying the drones came in and found them. And we were very excited that this would be something we could use. But we found when we tested this on Murrelet nests that we had already located, that it just didn't work because the Murrelets, they get very low on the nest and they don't give off much of a signal. And when the drone would go around the perimeter of the branches in a given tree, there weren't many windows that they could look into and see that thermal signature. And they had to do this in real time on a tablet. There was no way to do it except to have one person driving or flying the drone and one person watching on the tablet saying, oh, I think I see something, go left, go right. What we found was a real problem was on the sunny days that we had, the sunspots on the upper canopy, everything looked like a Murrelet nest. So we probably missed some as we were going and looking through that. But suffice it to say, it didn't work out. And we've gone back to this more traditional approach. And so we can't use GPS tags like we thought we could. It's typical of other birds. And we can't use drones to kind of enhance things. We go to kind of an old school approach for finding nests in this particular study.
So you've been able to use some technology, but the bird just keeps to its name to still be elusive and not make it too easy for you.
Yes, yeah. This bird is designed by natural selection not to be found, so it's not surprising that we had trouble finding it.
Yeah, it's doing its job for sure. So the way you described that is that you have people spread out along the coast. You've got planes flying up and down the coast trying to find these birds. So that sort of tells me that maybe, you said at the beginning or a little bit earlier that you had to have some idea of where their migration pattern was or where they were coming in off the coast. But it sounds like there might be some regularity to that, but it's not very consistent every year, each season, because you have such a large scanning process. Is that correct? Or do they seem to, be in the same place regularly?
So I didn't mention the first part of how we tag the birds, which ties in with your question, and that is that we left Newport, Oregon, which was in the center of our study area, and we would go out at night tracking the bird or looking for the birds and trying to capture them. So we took a large research vessel out, offloaded a small Zodiac that was crammed with three guys who have about, by now they probably have 60 years of combined capture experience. And this is their specialty. They go out and they do a lot of captures of members of the auk family. And so what they found was that Murlets were pretty consistent in terms of where they were, but we were surprised in that they weren't all over the areas that we were searching. And there were certain hot spots right at the mouth of the Aquina River, for example, where we could always find birds. But what we wanted to do is move up the coast and down the coast from there within the range of the vessel that would give us an opportunity to have more sites where the birds would go inland. Ultimately, we did catch birds across that gradient. We ended up tagging 300 birds across 5 years of study. And interestingly enough, though, most of the nests that we found were in the Saisla National Forest. So that suggests that that particular land ownership is good for Murrelets because we know it has a lot of older forests in it. And so those birds were relatively consistent in terms of where they nested and where we found them, but there was variation between years. And in fact, the first year of the study in 2017, we tagged 61 birds, I think it was, and none of those birds went inland to nests. And in fact, most of the birds went south of our study area into Southern Oregon and California, and then a number of them went up into Washington and Northern Oregon. And that was a particularly surprising part of our study because we had assumed that if we captured birds right off the Oregon coast, they were going to stay there. And I think that's true when the ocean conditions are good. But in 2017, the year that I'm referring to, the ocean conditions were quite poor and they weren't great for nesting. So the birds did not end up nesting. And then again, many of them moved out of our study area, presumably because they didn't have adequate food sources for themselves.
Okay, so that's interesting. So it sounds like the birds might be selective in choosing when they're going to have a reproduction year based on how well the ocean's doing. Can you talk about that a little bit more and how they how that interaction between the ocean and sort of forest ecosystems are relevant for the bird's survival?
Yeah, so Murrelets are, I think of them as birds of two worlds in that they're seabirds, and I think we see them on the coast and we often think about them there. If we are in the terrestrial side of things, foresters, land managers, we think about them in their nesting habitats. And I think sometimes we forget that they require both of those areas to be in those habitats to be in good shape. And so Murrelets are generalists in their foraging as adults, and they'll eat everything from invertebrates like krill all the way up to large forage fish like herring and anchovy. When they are provisioning their chick, though, they have to bring in forage fish, and they bring them in one at a time. There are some birds like puffins. Some of the iconic photos of tufted puffins are a bird with 6 or 7 or maybe even more small fish in its bill. That's not what Murrelets do. Murrelets catch one fish and they go all the way in and they deliver it to their chick, and then they come back to the water to either replenish their fuel reserves or to catch another fish for their chick. And they don't regurgitate food like some birds do, some ocean birds like that carry food internally, they carry it externally. And so it becomes very challenging for them when the conditions aren't good for forage fish because they're unable to raise their offspring. In 2017, when we started the project and when we had that year where we didn't have any birds nest, we were coming off of the blob. The blob was in 2014 to 2016. This was a marine heat wave in the North Pacific, and it led to huge die-offs in Alaska and in other parts. And so what we think happened in the Oregon coast is in 2017, there were still remnants of that effect. Some people call it the hangover from the blob, which sounds like a movie title.
It's a great movie title.
Yeah, and so those conditions kind of persisted into 2017 and weren't great They got better in 2018, but we're not kind of at the top of the list for what Murrelets would be based on long-term data off of the coast. So the point is really important, I think, to remember that Murrelets need really good ocean conditions. They need forage fish that they can rear their young on, but they also need healthy forests for them to have nesting sites, and they need them in close proximity. So we have to, if we think about Murrelets commuting to the coast to get a fish and they're going 25 miles, that's just 25 miles to the coast. They may still have to fly up and down the coast to find those fish, and then they've got to bring them back and do that back and forth. So the further those foraging and nesting areas are apart, the greater the energetic cost to the birds. And as you mentioned earlier, we think these are long-lived birds. We don't have data per se, but we know that some other members of the Murr family can live 15 or 20 years. So that, or I should say the auk family. So we think that Murrelets are probably in that same time range, but they only have one egg. And so that means that reproduction is very slow. And if that nest fails, which nest failure is pretty high in general, including in our study, that we don't have a lot of new offspring that are recruiting into the population in any given year.
Well, it sounds like you've been learning quite a bit from this study, but there's probably still a lot more to learn. What are some of the most key unanswered questions about the birds that you are looking forward to doing research on in the future?
Yeah, so Murrelets we mentioned that they're elusive and they're challenging to study. And despite our best efforts over 5 years, we ended up finding 37 nests, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's more than a doubling of the number of active nests in Oregon prior to our project. So in that sense, our project was really successful, but there are lots of things that are unanswered about Murrelets at the current time. One of the things that we don't know is, where do our birds go in the wintertime? The tags that we use only stay on for about 3 months, and our tagging, it takes place in May. So by late September or so, when the birds are starting to molt their feathers off, they actually lose that tag over the wintertime. And so we don't know where they go. There has been data from British Columbia showing that at least a couple of birds have moved from British Columbia and moved all the way up to the Aleutian Islands to head up there in late fall. Whether they stayed there or not, we don't have information on that because the tags weren't transmitting after that period. But we have at least some evidence that birds undertake long distance movements. We also don't have a good understanding of how often birds are moving between different conservation zones. And that becomes really important because I guess we haven't mentioned it out loud, but a lot of your listeners probably recognize that Murrelets are listed under the Endangered Species Act in California, in Oregon, and Washington, and they have similar protections in British Columbia. So one of the things about the population in the US that's listed is that we have different conservation zones where there are at-sea surveys conducted. It used to be conducted on an annual basis, but because of budget constraints, it's gone back to every other year and to every other conservation zone. So there isn't kind of a full sweep of the whole year. We used to think that Murrelet stayed pretty much in the conservation zone where they were at the start of the breeding season, but our tagging study showed that wasn't the case, that our birds were moving out of Oregon to California and north to Washington. So one key thing to know is there similar movements of birds from California up into Oregon and Washington, and from Washington birds south, and how much mixing is going on in the population? Because if there is a lot of mixing going on, we really need to be thinking about what those at-sea survey data tell us, because if we're assuming we're counting birds in a conservation zone and that's how many are there, that could very well be true. But if they're moving back and forth, we're actually counting a mix of birds from different locations. So that's another piece. It's a really challenging piece to get at. I think one of the best things that we can do is to try and get those surveys going on an annual basis again. And there's certainly efforts in that regard to try and get funding to have annual surveys, but also to have some sort of tag that would stay on the bird year round. So we could tell if a bird might be in Oregon for the summer, but then move into another part of its range in the wintertime and then maybe back to Oregon. We did have at least one bird that was tagged in Oregon in 2017, went to Washington that year because of the ostensibly the lack of food resources, and then came back to Oregon to breed in a separate year. So that suggests that there is some sort of faithfulness to Oregon when conditions are good, but we only had I think one bird out of 300 do that. So trying to understand what the population norm is going to be really critical going forward.
And how do you think that will inform us in the future? Would that be helpful to know more about, those conservation areas for their nesting sites and how regular they need to be along the coast? Or what questions does that answer?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, is trying to understand where we know a lot of the nesting hotspots from records from a number of different studies. There's been large-scale studies in Oregon, Washington, California, British Columbia now. But where the birds are in relation to those those nesting areas, and then what are they doing in years when we don't have good ocean conditions? Are they moving? We don't think they're breeding in other areas, but what are they doing during that period, that downtime? And then one of the questions that we tried to answer with the movement data that we had was, to what extent are Murrelets using marine protected areas? And it turns out that Oregon doesn't have a really large number of marine protected areas. And the Murrelets that we tagged in those particular years were not using a lot of those areas. So I think some of the work may be around figuring out hotspots for Murrelet activity and potential ways that we may be able to mitigate some of the concerns around Murrelet mortality and morbidity in ocean areas. And so one thing, if you think about it, I mentioned Yaquina, the outlet of the Yaquina River in Newport is a big spot for the birds. Well, it's also a huge spot for a lot of vessels coming and going, both commercial and recreational. So trying to figure out if there may be other areas that Murrelets are also using, and that if those might be areas that may have additional protections. That's well beyond my area of expertise, but I think it's something that is worth considering given the importance of the marine environment for the birds. On the other side, one of the other areas that I didn't mention that is worthy of additional research is understanding the relationship between Murrelet nesting and edges. We had a graduate student who just wrapped up a thesis this fall, and what he was finding is that Murrelets don't seem to spend a lot of time in areas that have edges, or that they're not having nests in areas with a lot of edge. But we also know that the coast range has a lot of fragmentation and a lot of edges from anthropogenic disturbances, harvests, homesteads, things like that. So I'm trying to understand that relationship between predation and edge. And we have different types of edges that may be there, hard edge, where there's just a, kind of a line between very young trees and very old trees, or whether different types of edges may lead to different outcomes for Murrelet nesting. That's an unanswered question. We did the best that we could with our birds, but the way that we tagged them on the ocean and let them come inland meant that we weren't studying particular areas that did or did not have edges. So a more focused study could perhaps tease that apart.
Hey, that sounds really interesting. I think that would be a question that, a lot of land managers would be interested in hearing about. Okay, well, I feel like I've learned quite a bit more about this bird today. Thank you so much for taking the time to share the research that your lab has been doing and talking about marbled murrelet. So we're about to wrap it up here. I'm going to make you sit through our lightning round in just a minute. But just a reminder to our listeners that if you have any other questions that came up, or we didn't cover a specific topic related to today's episode, drop us a comment or send us a message on our website so we can twist Jim's arm and have him come back and answer those questions. You can do that at inthewoodspodcast.com. Okay, Jim, here comes our lightning round. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, what is your favorite tree?
My favorite tree, I think, is a sugar maple, because I'm from New England, and that is such an iconic tree, and it provides us with maple syrup.
Yeah, delicious. Do you have pancakes regularly that you can put that maple syrup on?
Pancakes, French toast, and waffles are staples of our household, so yes.
All right, delicious. Okay, what is the most interesting thing that you bring with you in the field, whether it's in a vest or field kit or your truck? I guess we're on your boat.
I don't know if it's the most interesting thing, but certainly I think it's the most important, and that is my camera. Because when I'm in the field, there are lots of things that I find are useful for documentation, whether I'm doing research, going for a hike. I teach several classes at OSU, so having images that are real world images that come from our local area can be really useful for both giving presentations based on research that our lab does, but also to talk to students about the forest around us.
It's a great tool. I'm sure your students really appreciate it. It makes the talks more lively. Okay, and then lastly, do you have any resources that you can recommend for our listeners if they're interested in diving in a little bit deeper about marbled murrelet after today?
I do. So several years ago, when we were in the middle of our project, Oregon Field Guide came out with us, and they did an episode on what it was like to study marbled murrelets and do marbled murrelet research. And they came out in the woods with us and hiked into a couple of sites. And they also got out on the boat with us too, to see what that process was like. And they did an excellent job. And it really captured the challenges and the intricacies of working with this species. So I think if your listeners are interested in Murrelets, that is a great episode to watch.
Okay, amazing. We'll have the link to that episode on our website, so you can check it out there, along with information about Jim's favorite tree and some cameras. And I want to thank you again for being on the podcast with me today, Jim.
Thank you.
It was really a pleasure talking to you and learning about your research.
Yeah, it's always fun to talk about Murrelets.
I learned so much today. Unlike most seabirds, Murrelets nest high in the mossy limbs of older trees, sometimes over 50 miles inland, making them so difficult to study. So we're so glad that Jim was able to share his information about how they tag the birds and how they nest and how they track their movement, so that we can learn a lot more about how to care for and maintain these birds on our landscapes. That's all we have for you today. Thank you again for joining us on another episode of In the Woods. Join us in another couple of weeks to learn more about Oregon's amazing forests. Until then, what's in your woods? The In the Woods podcast is produced by Lauren Grand, Jacob Putney, and Scott Levengood, who are all members of the Oregon State University Forestry and Natural Resources Extension team. Other members of the team who've been involved in the podcast include Carrie Berger, Jason O'Brien, and Stephen Fitzgerald. Episodes are edited and produced by Carrie Cantrell. Music for In the Woods was composed by Jeffrey Heino, and graphic design was created by Christina Freihoff. Funding for In the Woods is provided by Oregon State University Forestry and Natural Resources Extension, the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, and the USDA Renewable Resources Extension Act funding. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we can't wait to talk to you again next month. Until then, what's in your woods?